The knife came out of nowhere. 1 second, the parking lot behind Della's diner was empty. The next, a man in a gray hoodie had 7-year-old Jace Mercer pinned against the back wall, blade catching the last dying glow of a broken flood lamp. Jace's arm was already bleeding. He'd caught the edge trying to pull 5-year-old Ember away from the van. He hadn't let go. He still wasn't letting go. The man hit him again. Ribs cracked. Gravel tore his palms. Ember's crying cut through the night like a siren no one was answering. By sunrise, 200 motorcycles would be rolling across 3 state lines. For a homeless boy who had nothing left to lose and still chose to bleed. Hey, if you've never heard a story like this one, you need to stay until the very end, because this isn't about motorcycles. It isn't about revenge. It's about a little boy who had been invisible his entire life, and one night he made himself a target so a little girl wouldn't have to be. Drop a like right now if you're already feeling it, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know where this story is landing. Let's go. The diner closed at 10. Della's was the kind of place that had stopped trying to look like anything a long time ago. The sign above the door had lost 2 letters. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and gravel, divided by a drainage strip that filled with standing water every time it rained. And it rained a lot in Calvary, Missouri in November. There was a payphone on the east wall that hadn't worked in 4 years. A dumpster on the west side that smelled like old grease and something worse underneath. 2 floodlights above the back exit, one of which had been flickering for 3 weeks, dying and catching, like something that didn't know it was already gone. Jace Mercer knew that parking lot better than he knew most human faces. He'd been sleeping near that dumpster, off and on, since early October. Not because it was comfortable. Nothing about it was comfortable. The concrete radiated cold by 9 o'clock, and the drainage strip flooded if you put your bag too close to the center. But Della's back door got propped open during the dinner rush, and if you were small enough and quiet enough and desperate enough, sometimes a cook would leave a plate on the step without saying anything, without looking at you, without making it into something that required a conversation. Jace had learned to survive on the edges of other people's kindness, the kindness that didn't ask for anything back, the kindness that could be taken away the moment it became an inconvenience. He was 7 years old. He had been on the street in varying configurations of alone for 22 months. He didn't think of himself as a homeless kid. He didn't think of himself as anything with a label. Labels were what caseworkers used, and caseworkers were what happened when the system noticed you, and the system noticing you was almost always worse than the system ignoring you. He thought of himself as someone who was getting through the day, then getting through the next one, then figuring out where to sleep before the temperature dropped below the point where sleeping outside meant not waking up. He'd gotten pretty good at surviving. He wasn't good at much else. He met Ember Vale on a Tuesday, which was the day Della's got their bread delivery, and sometimes left the damaged loaves in a plastic bag by the back step instead of throwing them away. Jace had been reaching for the bag when he heard something move near the chain-link fence on the south end of the lot. He froze. His body had developed a kind of alarm system over the months, a tightening in his chest, a sharpening behind his eyes, that activated whenever something changed in a space he'd mapped as safe. He scanned the fence, saw nothing at first, then saw her. She was tiny. Curly red hair tangled around a face that was simultaneously very young and very serious. The face of a child who had been told to stay somewhere and was doing her absolute best to stay there, while everything inside her wanted to go somewhere else. She was crouched against the base of the fence with her knees pulled up to her chest and a paper butterfly folded from the corner of a paper bag clutched in both hands. She wasn't crying. She was watching him the way animals watch things they haven't decided to trust yet. He stood there with a damaged loaf of bread and looked at her. She looked at him. "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," she said very seriously. "Okay," he said. "Are you a stranger?" He thought about it. Probably. She considered this. Then she held out the paper butterfly. "I made it. You can have it if you want. I know how to make more." He didn't take it. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because it felt like the kind of gift that came attached to something, and he'd learned not to take things that came attached to something. He just stood there and looked at it, and something moved in his chest that he didn't have a name for, because nobody had ever taught him the name for it. "Where's your mom?" he asked. "Inside." She pointed vaguely toward the diner. "She went to get napkins. She told me to stay by the fence." A pause. I stayed by the fence. Yeah, I can see that. You should eat something, she said. She was looking at him the way nobody ever looked at him, like she was actually seeing him, not seeing through him, not calculating how to handle him, just looking. You look like you didn't eat. He looked down at the loaf of bread in his hands. I'm working on it, he said. He didn't know her name that night. She went back inside when her mother came to the door, and Jace took his bread and moved to the far end of the lot, and he ate half of it sitting with his back against the concrete wall with the broken floodlight flickering above him. And he thought about the paper butterfly and the way she'd held it out without any calculation in her face at all, just the pure, uncomplicated belief that giving things to people was what you did. He slept badly. He usually slept badly. The cold had teeth in it that month. He saw her again on Thursday. She was back at the same fence, this time with a juice box and another paper butterfly, this one red, made from the inside of a cereal box. She waved when she saw him, like they knew each other, like he was someone worth waving at. He raised his hand back, almost surprised to find himself doing it. Her name, she told him, was Ember. She was 5. Her mom's name was Mara, and her dad was at work a lot, but he always came to tuck her in. She liked butterflies and the color orange and macaroni without the cheese part. She did not like loud motorcycles. Your dad have a motorcycle? He asked. A lot of motorcycles, she said. Well, his friends do. They're all really loud. They come to our house sometimes, and they're really, really big, and they have these... She gestured vaguely at her own chest, approximating what was clearly a vest or jacket. And they're kind of scary, but Daddy says they're good. Are they? I think so. She tilted her head. Daddy's always good, even when he looks scary. Jace didn't say anything to that. He didn't have a frame of reference. He had a biological father who was a name on a court document and a mother who had surrendered him to the county at age 5 during a hospitalization she never came back from. He had 3 foster placements in 18 months, and he had learned something distinct from each of them, that he was too quiet to be endearing, too old to be easily adopted, too damaged to be manageable, and too proud to pretend otherwise. The last placement had ended when he'd told a caseworker that he'd rather sleep outside than go back. He hadn't entirely meant it at the time. He'd mostly meant it by November. He didn't tell Ember any of that. She was 5. She had a dad who tucked her in. You should eat something, she told him again. She seemed to have decided this was her primary contribution to their friendship. I'm okay, he said. You always say that. I've only seen you twice. She looked at him like this was not a meaningful counter-argument. By the second week of November, he'd seen her 4 more times. Mara, he gathered, met a friend at Della's on certain evenings. A standing arrangement, the kind of predictable routine that people with stable lives built around themselves. Ember always came. Ember was not the kind of child who could be parked quietly in a booth with a coloring book, and Mara had apparently accepted this, so Ember was allowed to be in the parking lot if she stayed by the fence and didn't go near the dumpster. She always went to the fence, and Jace was always eventually at the fence, and they talked. Or she talked, and he listened, which he was better at. She told him about her kindergarten class, and a girl named Sophie who could stand on one foot for 30 whole seconds, and a book about a fox that she'd heard so many times she could say it along word for word. She showed him 3 more paper butterflies, progressively more elaborate. She asked him where he lived. He paused long enough that she noticed. Far away, he said. Does it take a long time to get there? Not really. She seemed to accept this. Then, do you have a mom? The November cold had a particular quality that night. It came from the north and had water in it, the edge of something that might become sleet by morning. Jace pulled his jacket tighter. It was a men's medium, found in a donation bin, too big in the shoulders and too thin for the weather, but it was what he had. No, he said. Do you have a dad? No. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was careful in the way 5-year-olds are careful when they've touched something they didn't mean to. That's sad, she said. It's okay. It's not, though. She said it with total seriousness, not unkindly, just factually, the way children sometimes see things that adults have learned to decorate. It's not okay. It's really sad, and it's not okay, but I think you're really brave. He didn't say anything. She held out the paper butterfly, the red one. "You can have this one. I mean it." This time he took it. He didn't think about what was building. He was 7. He didn't think about things in terms of what they were building toward. He just knew that Thursday evenings had become something he was aware of the way he was aware of his own breathing. Not consciously, just always there. Just real. Just the thing that told him he was still in the world. On the last Thursday of November, Ember didn't come to the fence. The diner's back light was on. Mara's car was in the lot. He'd learned to recognize it, a blue SUV with a scratch along the rear panel. But no Ember. Jace waited longer than he usually would. Told himself he wasn't waiting. Ate half a protein bar he'd found in the donation shed behind the Methodist outreach 2 blocks over and told himself it tasted fine. Watched the broken floodlight die and catch, die and catch. He was about to leave when he heard the sound. Not crying. It was more trapped than crying. The sound of someone who wanted to cry but was too scared to make the noise. It was coming from the gap between the dumpster and the south wall. The space he never went because the drainage smell was bad, and the angle made it invisible from the parking lot entrance. He moved toward it before he thought about it. That was the other thing his alarm system had developed, the ability to recognize the sound of a child who was very afraid and very alone. Ember was pressed into the corner, both hands over her mouth, her eyes above her hands, very wide and very locked onto something at the end of the lot he hadn't seen yet. He turned. The van had come in without headlights. He hadn't heard it over the wind. It was parked sideways across the lot exit, and a man in a gray hoodie was moving toward them with the very deliberate quietness of someone who had done this before, who had planned the approach, who knew exactly how much time he had and how much noise was acceptable. He was not running. Running was panicked. This was practiced. This was worse than panicked. Jace did not make a decision. He moved. He stepped between Ember and the man. He spread his arms. The man stopped. Looked at him, looked at Ember, made a calculation. "Move, kid," he said. "No," Jace said. Later, much later, Jace would not be able to explain what happened in those seconds. He would not be able to explain why he didn't run. There was a gap in the fence behind him. He'd used it before. He could have taken Ember's hand and run, and maybe made it. He would not be able to explain what it felt like to stand there at 7 years old, looking at a man twice his height, with a decision already written in his body that had nothing to do with reason. He had nothing. He had never had anything. But she was behind him, and she had given him a paper butterfly, and she was the only person in 22 months who had looked at him like he was there, like he was real, like his presence in the world was not a complication to be managed. So he stood. The knife came out of the man's jacket pocket without ceremony, just metal catching the dying floodlight for half a second. Jace had a fraction of a moment to understand what it was before the man moved, and then there was fire up his left arm, deep and bright and total. And he was on the ground on one knee, but he was still between Ember and the man, and he was not moving. "Move," the man said again. His voice had changed, something annoyed in it now. "No," Jace said. His arm was bleeding badly. He could feel it. The warmth was running down to his wrist and dripping off his fingers, and the cold air was making the pain brighter, sharper, more specific. His ribs took the boot a second later, a solid impact that sent him sideways into the gravel. And then he was flat, and his vision was filling with black edges, and he could hear Ember screaming, finally making the noise, and he reached out his good hand and found the hem of her jacket and held on. He held on. He held on while boots hit gravel, and voices he didn't recognize appeared from the direction of the diner door, and the man in the gray hoodie made a sound of anger, and the van engine turned over, and then there were hands. Adult hands. A woman's voice. Someone calling 911. Someone saying, oh God, look at his arm." And Ember was being lifted, and Jace still had his hand closed around a fistful of her jacket, and he didn't open it. Even when the grown-up hands tried to calm him, even when the warmth was spreading too fast from his arm and the parking lot lights were going strange around the edges, he kept his hand closed. She wasn't gone. He could feel her jacket in his hand. She wasn't gone. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee, and something underneath both of those that Jace associated with places where people waited for news. He had been in a hospital twice before, both times as a result of situations and foster placements, that had been deemed serious enough to warrant documentation. He knew the particular quality of fluorescent light in waiting rooms. He knew the sound of an IV drip. He knew the way nurses spoke to children they felt sorry for. A specific register, brighter than normal, with a gentle pressure in it that meant you were supposed to feel reassured even though the brightness itself was the tell. He woke up with his arm bandaged from elbow to wrist, 3 taped ribs, and a woman he didn't know sitting next to the bed crying into her hands. He stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent light was the same. The woman was Mara Vale, though he didn't know that yet. She was beautiful the way some people are beautiful when they're wrecked, not despite the crying, but sort of illuminated by it, honest in a way that polished people rarely are. She had Ember's red hair. She had the particular stillness of someone who had been holding herself together through an act of will and had, just now, let go for a moment. She looked up and found him looking at her. "Hi," she said. Her voice was raw. "Hi," he said. "How do you feel?" "Okay," he said. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You're not okay. You have a significant laceration and 3 fractured ribs. You are probably the furthest thing from okay." He considered this. "I feel like I'm alive." "You are." She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. "Jace." "Your name is Jace?" "Yeah." "Jace." She said his name like she was checking that it was real. "My daughter is in the next room. She is scared and she is shaken and she's going to be fine, and the only reason any of that is true is because of you." He didn't say anything. He looked at the IV in the back of his hand. "I need you to understand something," Mara said. "You're not alone here anymore, okay? You are not alone in this building. My husband is outside. He's been outside since they brought you in. He needed a minute." She paused. Something moved in her face. "He tends to need a minute before he can come into hospitals." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. "He was in the service. 2 tours. Some things are hard." Jace nodded. He didn't fully understand, but he understood the idea of things being hard in ways you couldn't explain to people who didn't have the same things. "Who's my caseworker?" he asked. It was the first practical question, the one his brain produced automatically, the one that told the story of how his life worked. Mara looked at him. "I don't know yet, but we're going to figure it all out. Tonight you sleep. Tonight you're safe." She reached out and very carefully, very deliberately, placed her hand over the back of his, the unbandaged one. She didn't squeeze. She just let it rest there. "Is that okay?" He looked at her hand on his. He looked at it for a long time. "Yeah," he said. "That's okay." He woke again at 4 in the morning to the sound of motorcycles. Not close, not right outside the window, but enough of them, far enough off in the direction of the highway, that the sound came through the glass like weather, a low collective thunder, a rumble that you felt in your sternum before your ears fully processed it. He lay still and listened and counted without knowing he was counting. It was more than 10, more than 20. The sound had a shape to it, a coordinated quality that was not random traffic. He was still listening when the door opened. The man who came in didn't come in the way nurses came in, with purpose and brisk professionalism, or the way Mara had been, with the visible effort of someone performing calm. He came in the way the cold came in, quietly and completely, like a thing that had been outside the door for a long time already and simply decided to come through. He was a large man, not in the exaggerated way of someone who cultivated size as a statement, but in the way of a person who had simply always been built for hard work and hard weather and hadn't spent any time trying to look like something else. He wore a leather cut over a flannel shirt, and the cut had patches on it that Jace couldn't read in the low light, and his hands, when he sat down in the chair Mara had been in, were the hands of someone who had done things with them that left marks. There were actual marks, old ones, the kind that came from long before he could remember to start being careful. He sat down. He looked at Jace. He didn't say anything for a long time. Jace looked back. He wasn't frightened exactly. He was calibrating. He had developed a finely tuned sense for the quality of adult attention, which kind was management, which kind was pity, which kind had an agenda underneath it, which kind was real. He was trying to read this one. My wife says you wouldn't let go, the man said finally. His voice was low. The kind of low that came from the chest, not the throat. Even after he cut you, even when he knocked you down, she says they had to talk to you for 30 seconds to get you to open your hand. Jace didn't confirm or deny. He waited. Why? The man asked. It was the simplest question and also in some way the most impossible one. Jace looked at the window. The sky outside was the particular dark blue that happened just before it decided to become something else. She gave me a butterfly, he said. The man was quiet. That was the whole reason? He asked. She looked at me, Jace said. He wasn't sure how to say the rest of it. He wasn't sure there was a rest of it exactly. She looked at me like I was there. The man put his elbows on his knees. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes for a moment. Not in the way of someone performing a motion, but in the way of someone holding something back that had been pressing at the gate for a while. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were very steady. My name's Ronan, he said. Jace, Jace said. I know. A pause. I've been told. Outside, the distant rumble of motorcycles had settled into something that was almost like a perimeter in sight. Not pacing, not restless, just present. Present the way Wade is present. Ronan looked toward the window without quite looking through it, and Jace understood somehow, in the wordless language of watching people's bodies say things their mouths weren't saying, that those engines outside were connected to this man in the chair, that the sound was not random, that it was a particular kind of announcement. Are they yours? Jace asked. Ronan glanced at him. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recognition, the look of a person who has been assessed and found to be correctly read. Some of them, he said. The rest are brothers who heard what happened. Heard already? Word moves fast when it has to. Jace thought about that. He looked at the ceiling. I didn't know she was your daughter, he said. When I didn't know who she was. I didn't know anything about you. I just knew her. Ronan looked at him for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed above them. Somewhere down the corridor, a machine beeped its steady and different rhythm. When Ronan finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, and the quietness had an edge to it that was not threatening. It was the edge of something carefully controlled. That makes it more, not less, he said. Well done. By morning, the hospital knew there were bikers in the parking lot. The day shift nurses talked about it in the station at the end of the corridor, their voices carrying just enough for Jace to catch the shape of the conversation through his partially open door. He was good at half-heard conversations. He'd had to become good at them. 37 motorcycles. That was what one nurse said. She'd counted from the east window. Jace lay with his taped ribs and his bandaged arm and his IV drip, and he thought about that number. 37. Men who had ridden through a November night because a 7-year-old homeless kid they'd never met had bled in a parking lot for a little girl who wasn't his to protect. He didn't understand it, but he felt it. It sat in his chest beside the cracked ribs, heavy and warm and completely unfamiliar. A caseworker arrived at 9. Linda Marsh, late 40s, the third caseworker Jace had been assigned in 18 months. And he could tell within 30 seconds that she was competent and overworked and operating from a script that had been written for a situation she had not anticipated. She was visibly unsettled by the leather-vested men visible through the window. She was visibly unsettled by Ronan, who stood at the foot of the bed and didn't say much but didn't leave either. She did her documentation efficiently and kept looking at her tablet. Jace, we're going to need to talk about placement, she said. You're going to need continued medical care for at least... He'll have it, Ronan said. Marsh looked at him. I'm sorry? Whatever he needs. He'll have it. She pulled the professional register tighter around herself, the one that said she was the authority here and that a man with a road name embroidered on a patch did not get to make determinations about the county's jurisdiction over a minor. Mr. Vale, she said carefully, the process for... I know the process, Ronan said. And that was it. He didn't elaborate. He didn't press. He just stood there, and the quality of his standing was such that the process force seemed to run out of air in the room and become a smaller thing. Marsh looked at her tablet. We'll talk more when Jace is stable. She glanced at Jace. Is there anything you need right now? Anything I can get you? Jace looked at Ronan. Ronan was looking at the window. Outside, somewhere below, 37 engines had not started up and left. They were still there. I'm okay, Jace said. The same thing he always said. He said it this time with something he couldn't quite name shifting slowly underneath it. Ember came at 10, walking ahead of a nurse and Mara, with the unstoppable confidence of a child who has decided something and is going to do it. She was wearing a hospital gown over her clothes that someone had put on her as a precaution, and she had clearly not been asked whether she wanted the hospital gown. She walked straight to the side of the bed and stood there and looked at Jace with her serious, level 5-year-old gaze. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. Your arm is wrapped. Yeah. Does it hurt? He considered the diplomatic answer versus the true one. She was 5, but she wasn't that kind of 5. Yeah, he said. Okay. She reached into the front pocket of her overalls. She'd apparently put overalls on under the hospital gown, which was its own kind of statement, and produced a folded piece of paper. White. Very precisely folded. She held it out to him. A butterfly. He looked at it. I made it from a cup, she explained. The nurse let me have the paper part of a cup. You already have the red one. This one's white. White means you're still here. He took it. He held it in his bandaged hand carefully. Ember, Mara said quietly from the doorway. I'm telling him the rule, Ember said, without looking away from Jace. The rule is that if you have the butterfly, it means you're still here. It means you count. It means you're real. She watched him with those direct, uncomplicated eyes. Okay? His throat had done something that made speaking difficult. Okay, he managed. She nodded. Then she reached out and very gently, very carefully, put her small hand on his unbandaged forearm, below the edge of the wrappings, on the strip of intact skin near his wrist, and held it there for a moment. Not squeezing, just holding. The same way Mara had held his hand the night before, like she had learned the gesture from watching her mother. He didn't know, sitting in that hospital bed at 7 years old with a cut arm and cracked ribs and 37 motorcycles still rumbling in the lot below, that this moment was the first brick of something. That in the weeks and months ahead, the ground underneath him was going to do something it had never done in 22 months, something he didn't have a word for yet. He had learned not to believe in things that felt solid. Everything solid eventually went away. But Ember's hand was warm, and somewhere below the window, those engines had not left. But the afternoon brought 3 men in leather cuts to the corridor outside his room. Not inside. They stayed in the hall, which Jace suspected was a deliberate choice, keeping the space his, not overwhelming it. He could see them through the gap in the door that the nurses kept partially open for air circulation. They were large men, all of them, with the particular ease of people who had learned to take up space on their own terms without being careless about it. One of them was older, gray at the temples, wearing reading glasses he kept folded in his breast pocket. One of them was very young, not much older than 20, Jace estimated, with the kind of lean that meant he was still finding the edges of himself. The third sat with his back against the wall and his eyes on the corridor in both directions, and he had a way of going very still that Jace recognized as the stillness of someone trained to wait. He watched them the way he watched everything from the sides of his eyes, without looking like he was watching. He noticed that none of them had their phones out. That was unusual. Every adult he had known spent significant portions of their time looking at phones, and he had come to understand it as a kind of automatic reaching, something to do with the hands when they weren't sure what else to do. These men didn't seem to need anything to do with their hands. They simply occupied the space in the corridor and made it quieter by being in it. Ronan appeared at 2 o'clock, came into the room without ceremony, and pulled the chair close to the bed. He was carrying 2 coffees from the vending alcove down the hall, cheap paper cups, the kind that left a ring on whatever you set them on. He held one out to Jace. You old enough for coffee? He asked. No, Jace said. You survived a knife and 3 cracked ribs last night. Jace took the coffee. They sat with that for a moment. The coffee was bad. Jace drank it like it was the best thing he'd had in months, which, in a specific technical sense, it was. We found out some things, Ronan said. He was looking at his own cup. His voice had gone to the careful register, the one that meant what was coming was not simple. About the man in the lot, and about some other things connected to him. Jace waited. "He's not alone," Ronan said. "What he's part of, it's bigger. Kids moved across state lines. Mostly kids nobody's going to look for." He paused. "Kids like you were, before last night." Jace absorbed this slowly. He thought about the 2 years of parking lots and donation bins and half-heard conversations, and the particular invisibility of being a small person in a big system that had too many people in it to notice one more. He thought about the specific way certain men had looked at him over the months, in certain places, a look he'd learned to move away from quickly, a look that had something calculating in it that he didn't have the full vocabulary for, but that his body understood. "How many?" he asked. "We don't know yet." Ronan set down his coffee. "Our guys are working on it, and we're talking to some people." He glanced at Jace. "Good people. Law." "You work with law enforcement?" Ronan let out a breath that was something like a short laugh. "When it matters. This matters." The afternoon light was changing in the window, going to the gray gold of late November in Missouri, the color that didn't promise anything. Jace held his paper cup in both hands and looked at it, and thought about all the kids he'd seen in parking lots and shelters and the edges of places, the ones nobody could pick out of a crowd because they had spent so long learning not to be picked out that they had become their own invisibility. "They won't find all of them," he said. It wasn't despair. It was fact. "No," Ronan said. He didn't dress it up. "But they'll find more than if we don't try." He looked at Jace directly, "And the man who came for Ember last night won't find anyone else." Jace looked at the window. Outside, the motorcycle sound had changed, quieter now, but it hadn't gone. Like something had shifted from declaration to settlement, like the presence had decided to become permanent. "Why are they still here?" Jace asked. "Your guys, why haven't they left?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee and held it without drinking. "Because you're still here," he said, like it was the most logical thing in the world, like it required no additional explanation. Jace sat with that answer for a long time. He held his bad coffee. He looked at the white paper butterfly on the bedside table. Outside the partially opened door, the 3 men in the corridor were still there, occupying the space, making the hallway quieter by being in it. He still didn't trust it. He had learned not to trust things that felt like they might be real. But the engines hadn't gone. And in the quiet room, with the gray November light and the distant rumble and the butterfly on the table, Jace Mercer closed his eyes and, for the first time in 22 months, slept without waking up to check whether the world had left him in the night. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, lying in that hospital bed with his cracked ribs and his bandaged arm, was what had been set in motion in the hours while he was unconscious. He didn't know that Ronan Vale had made 3 phone calls from the hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning, standing in the cold with his breath coming in short, visible clouds, his voice very controlled and very quiet in the way it got when the control was doing a lot of work. He didn't know that those 3 calls had cascaded into 12 more across 2 states, each one adding a name, a location, a piece of information that the men receiving them already knew how to process. He didn't know that by 4 in the morning, the Iron Reapers had intelligence about the man in the gray hoodie that the county sheriff's office wouldn't have for another 6 hours. He didn't know that the van that had sat in Della's parking lot had been traced to a storage facility 40 miles east, and that the storage facility had connections to a name that had appeared in 3 separate federal case files over 18 months without ever quite becoming a prosecution. He didn't know any of that. What he knew was that he was warm, that his arm hurt, but he was warm, that there was a paper butterfly on the table that had been made from the paper part of a cup, that Ember Vale's small, warm hand had rested on his wrist for 30 seconds and meant it. What he didn't know yet was what would be discovered in that storage facility 2 nights later, in the dark, in the freezing river fog, with the Iron Reapers and 3 federal agents moving through the shadows between containers. What they would find, what he would have to face when he learned what they'd found, and what it would cost every single person in that hospital parking lot, every leather cut, every crack-knuckled hand, every man who had answered a phone call at 2 in the morning and ridden through the November dark without being asked twice. when the people who had built that network realized that the 7-year-old nobody had survived and started looking for leverage. They found the first body on a Wednesday. Not a child. That was the detail Ronan gave Jace 3 weeks later when Jace was out of the hospital and the question had become impossible to avoid. Not a child, he said. A man, early 30s, found in the river shallows 4 miles east of the storage facility, hands bound, 2 gunshot wounds. Identification that traced back to a name that had appeared twice in the federal paperwork connected to the trafficking network. A man who had apparently decided at some point in the 48 hours after the Iron Reapers began moving around the edges of the operation that cooperating with the wrong side of a collapsing organization was a faster way to die than cooperating with law enforcement. He had been wrong about the timing. Ronan told Jace this because Jace had asked directly, and Ronan had a rule about direct questions from people who had earned the right to ask them. He believed that people who had bled for something were owed the truth about what that something was. Jace was 7. He'd been out of the hospital for 11 days. He was living, temporarily, in the guest room of Ronan and Mara's house in Calhoun Ridge, a provisional arrangement that Linda Marsh had authorized with the specific, careful language of someone who knew she was doing something slightly outside the lines of protocol and had decided the lines were, in this particular case, the wrong place to draw. The guest room had a window that faced the backyard. There was a maple tree close enough that its branches touched the glass when the wind moved, a scratching sound that Jace had spent his first 2 nights cataloging as harmless. The bed had 4 pillows. He used one and arranged the other 3 against the wall because he wasn't entirely sure what you were supposed to do with 4 pillows, and he didn't want to get it wrong. He ate dinner with Ronan and Mara and Ember every night. This was the thing that undid him most consistently, though he was careful not to show it. Not the bed, not the room, not the hot shower every morning that he stood under for 6 minutes precisely because it seemed greedy to take more. The dinner table, the specific, ordinary, devastating ritual of 4 people sitting down together and passing things and asking each other about their days. Ember always told him about her day in precise sequential order, never skipping anything, treating each event with equal narrative importance. The thing Sophie had said at school, and the thing the art teacher had done with the glue sticks, and the specific clouds she had seen from the bus window. He listened like she was reading from something sacred. He didn't tell them about his days. His days were mostly the interior landscape of a child who had learned to keep his own company and was now surrounded by people and did not know what to do with the surplus of presents. He went with Mara to the medical follow-up appointments. He did the reading exercises Linda Marsh had arranged with a local school liaison, 2 hours every Tuesday and Thursday in Mara's kitchen with a woman named Cora, who smelled like cedar and never made him feel stupid for the gaps in his education, of which there were many. He walked the perimeter of the backyard in the evenings, which was something he did to feel oriented, to establish the edges of a space before he trusted it. He was trying to trust it. He wasn't there yet. Each said, the man who arrived on the 12th day was named Deke, and he was the Iron Reapers road captain, which Jace understood to mean something significant in the club's hierarchy without yet fully understanding what. He was not as large as Ronan, but he carried himself with the same quality of deliberate stillness, the kind of stillness that came from having spent time in situations where any movement had consequences. He had a scar along his jawline that had the particular healed flatness of something old, something he had stopped thinking about. He drove a black Heritage, and he parked it at the curb in front of the house and came up the walk with his hands in the pockets of his cut, which Jace had learned was a deliberate posture. Hands visible or hands in pockets, never hovering, that the club's men seemed to use when they were entering spaces where their presence was being assessed. They were always being assessed. Jace understood this. He also understood that they knew it and had made a kind of peace with it. Deke sat at the kitchen table with Ronan and a road atlas that was so creased from folding and unfolding that the page edges had gone soft, and they talked for 2 hours in low voices with the kitchen door half open. Jace was supposed to be doing his reading exercises in the living room. He was doing them. He was also listening. He caught pieces, the storage facility, a secondary location outside a town called Mill Haven, 70 miles northeast. Federal agents named Carver and Tron, who had been building a case for 8 months and had recently experienced a significant acceleration in their timeline due to the events of the previous 3 weeks. A man named Hollis, who appeared to be a middle link in a chain that went both higher and lower than anything the federal case had documented so far. The word network, used repeatedly, with the particular flatness of people who had already done their grieving about what the word contained and were now in the operational stage. And then something that made him go very still in the living room chair, his reading exercise forgotten in his hands. "The boy," Deke said, "not unkindly, just factually, the way you named the thing you were accounting for. He's a loose thread. Hollis knows there was a witness. He doesn't know what the witness knows." A silence. "He's 7, Ronan said. "I know how old he is. He doesn't know anything that helps them. He was in a parking lot. He saw a man in a hoodie. Hollis doesn't know that." Another silence. Longer. "We keep the timeline," Ronan said. "We finish what Carver needs, then it's done." "And after?" A chair scraped, boots on the kitchen floor, a pause that had a shape to it. The shape of a man standing at a window, looking at something outside. "We figure out after," Ronan said, "when we get there." Jace set down his reading exercise. He looked at the ceiling of the living room. He'd been stared at by men who wanted something from him before. Different men, different wants, and he'd survived all of them by being small and quiet and forgettable. He was not sure being forgettable was an option anymore. He was not sure what options he had exactly. He was 7 years old and someone named Hollis was accounting for him. He picked the reading exercise back up. He kept his breathing even. He had gotten very good, over 22 months, at keeping his breathing even when the situation called for appearing like everything was fine. Everything was not fine. But he was still here. He still had the butterfly on the windowsill in the guest room. White, meaning you're still here. He held on to that. Ronan found him in the backyard that evening, doing his perimeter walk. The grass was dead from frost, and it crunched slightly underfoot, and the maple tree had shed most of its leaves by now, leaving a skeletal frame against the gray sky. Ronan stood at the back door for a moment, watching him before he came down the steps, and when he came down the steps, he walked alongside Jace without announcing himself, matching his pace. They walked the perimeter once in silence. "You heard us," Ronan said. It wasn't a question. "The door was half open," Jace said. Ronan made a sound that was not quite an apology and not quite dismissal. "Yeah, that was my mistake." "Who's Hollis?" Ronan looked at the far fence. "A man who runs things he shouldn't run." "Does he know where I am?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell Jace the answer was more complicated than no. "He knows the boy from the diner went to a hospital," Ronan said. "He doesn't know a name. He doesn't know where you are now. But he'll look. Maybe." "Probably," Jace said. Ronan stopped walking. Jace stopped too, and they stood at the corner of the yard where the fence met the maple tree's roots, and the cold moved between them. And Ronan looked at this 7-year-old kid in an oversized sweater that had been bought for him because his existing wardrobe consisted of 1 jacket, 2 shirts, and a pair of jeans with a tear at the left knee. And something in Ronan's face shifted. It shifted the way a foundation shifts, slowly, in the direction of something it had been resisting. "You're not going to disappear on us," Ronan said. "That's not going to happen." "How do you know?" "Because I won't let it." "You can't promise that," Jace said. And it wasn't resentment, it was just what he knew. Adults made promises about things they did not fully control because they wanted to believe the promises would help, and sometimes the wanting was sincere, and he did not doubt Ronan's sincerity. But sincerity was not the same as capacity, and he had lived too long in the gap between the two. Ronan looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," he said. "I can't guarantee everything, but I can tell you that there are 37 men, more now, 52 as of last week, who have made a decision about what matters. And one of the things that matters is you." He paused. "You want to tell me that's not enough? I'll hear it. But it's what I've got." Jace looked at the frozen grass. He thought about 52. He thought about Deke with his road atlas and his careful, factual accounting of the loose threads. He thought about Hollis, who who was a name without a face, which was somehow worse than a face. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Nothing," Ronan said immediately. "You're a kid. You need to stay in the house, do your reading, eat your dinner. That's all." "That's not all," Jace said. "You need me to be something that can't be used against you." The silence between them had a particular quality, the quality of an adult recognizing that a child has said something that should not be coming from a child, and not knowing whether to address the sophistication or the heartbreak underneath it. "Jace," Ronan said. "I've been managed before," Jace said. "Not with anger. With a calm that was its own kind of indictment. Caseworkers, foster parents, they always say there's nothing to worry about right before the thing I'm supposed to not worry about becomes the thing that changes everything." He looked at Ronan directly. "I'm not saying you're like that. I'm saying I need to know what's actually happening. If I'm involved, and Hollis makes me involved, whether you want me to be or not, then I need to know." The maple branches moved in the cold wind. The sound was like breathing, slow and irregular, the sound of something alive in the empty gray. Ronan pressed his lips together. He was quiet for long enough that Jace thought he was going to refuse, was going to say, "You're 7, and that's the end of it." "Next 2 weeks," Ronan said finally, "are going to be complicated. There's going to be an operation, federal-led with our people supporting. We're going to a location, and we're going to get some kids out of it, and we're going to close a door that should have been closed a long time ago." He kept his voice level, the level of someone who had briefed hard operations before and knew what information was load-bearing and what was noise. "You don't participate. You don't know specifics. But you know it's happening, and you know that when it's done, the direct threat is reduced significantly." "And Hollis?" "Hollis is part of what gets closed." Jace nodded. He looked at the fence. The specific, practical, 7-year-old part of his brain noted that the fence had a loose board on the east side, and that he had already identified the gap as large enough to get through quickly if he needed to. He had stopped doing that automatically. He had been trying to stop doing that. It kept happening anyway. "Okay," he said. They stood in the cold yard, and the maple breathed above them, and somewhere 3 streets over a Harley turned a corner and passed, and the sound came and went like punctuation, like the club reminding both of them that the perimeter was larger than this yard. Tic-tac. The trouble with Cage Morrow started on a Tuesday. Cage was the youngest patched member of the Iron Reapers, 22 years old, and he had the specific kind of young man's anger that had not yet been given enough time to figure out what it was actually about. He was not cruel. Jace had watched him long enough to determine that cruelty had a specific signature and Cage didn't have it. What he had was a rawness, a set of convictions that lived too close to the surface and came out sideways when he was pushed, and he had apparently decided in the weeks since the hospital that Jace was a complication. Not a bad kid. A complication. The distinction mattered. A bad kid could be written off. A complication was something that interrupted the operation of things that had been working before the complication arrived. Jace heard him say it to another prospect named Wash in the garage behind the Iron Reaper's chapter house, a long-converted warehouse space on the industrial east side of Calhoun Ridge, which Jace had been to twice now, both times brought by Ronan for what Ronan called getting familiar, and what the other men mostly treated as an inspection they had collectively agreed to make low pressure. He'd been in the side office looking at a map on the wall when he heard Cage and Wash in the garage. "Kid's been here 3 weeks, Cage said, the sound of something metallic being set down. "Every time Ronan's supposed to be running a meeting, he's on the phone about custody paperwork or school enrollment or some court thing." "So," Wash said. "So we've got a warehouse with 6 children in it and a timeline that just moved up 4 days, and the president of our chapter is running logistics on a family situation." A pause. "Ronan can walk and chew gum," Wash said. "I'm not saying he can't. I'm saying we brought in a loose thread and tied ourselves to it." A beat. "Kid's a target. We made ourselves a target." Jay stood very still by the wall map. He breathed through his nose. He had a particular technique for moments like this. He had developed it in foster homes when the conversations about him happened in the next room, where he flattened his own emotional response into something manageable and just listened, because information was more useful than reaction, and reaction had never once actually helped him. "You say that to Ronan?" Wash asked. "Tried. Got the look." Then you got your answer. I got his answer. I'm talking about what's right for the club. Another pause. Longer. Cage? Wash said, and his voice had shifted, had gone to something quieter. 7-year-old kid held on to a knife cut to keep Ember safe. You think about that before you finish that sentence. Silence. Jace waited. He heard Cage exhale, a long, structured breath, the breath of someone pushing something back down. I'm not saying he's not. Cage stopped. I'm saying the timing is bad. Yeah, Wash said. It is. Everything about this is bad. That's kind of the point. The metallic sound again, something being picked up. The conversation moved to the muffler on a specific heritage, and Jace turned back to the wall map and looked at the roads marked on it without seeing them. He was thinking about the word complication. He was thinking about how long it had taken him to understand, the first time, that being in a placement made him a complication rather than a person. How quickly he'd learned to read the signs. How familiar this particular shape of being in someone else's margin felt. He had been trying, in the guest room with the maple tree outside the window, not to think of himself as being in someone's margin. He thought about it now, carefully. The way you think about something you've been trying not to look at directly. He thought, Cage is not wrong about the timing. He thought, being a loose thread is a factual description of what I am in this situation. He thought, Ronan and Mara are doing something real, and they mean it, and it is still possible for a real thing done by people who mean it to also be complicated in ways that end badly. He went back to the main room. Deke was there with a coffee and a road atlas and the particular expression of a man with a permanent low-level headache. He looked at Jace. You good? He asked. Yeah, Jace said. Deke looked at him for a moment with the appraising stillness that Jace was beginning to recognize as the club's version of checking in. Not invasive, not emotional, just a look that said, I see you and I'm noting it. Cage is working through something, Deke said. Not an apology, just information. I know, Jace said. He's not wrong about everything. I know that too. Deke set down his coffee. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map rather than at Jace. You know what Cage went through before he patched? Before he found the club? Jace didn't. 3 years aging out of a system that couldn't figure out what to do with him, Deke said. Couch to couch. Couple of nights that were worse than couches. He paused. He's not afraid of you. He's afraid of what happens when the thing you care about gets used against you. He's seen it. Another pause. So have most of us. Jace thought about that. He thought about it for a long time, standing there in the chapter house with the smell of oil and cold air and old coffee, listening to the distant sound of someone doing something to an engine in the garage. How do you trust anything, then? He asked. Not rhetorically, actually asking. Deke picked up his coffee. Badly, he said. You trust things badly, and you trust them anyway. That's pretty much what it comes down to. He went back to his atlas. Jace stood there and decided, in the particular quiet way he made most of his decisions, that Deke was someone worth listening to. Yeah. The call came on a Friday night, 9 days before the operation was scheduled. Jace was asleep, actually asleep genuinely, which had become slightly more consistent over the past week, the guest room's scratching maple having been reclassified from threat to companion in the hierarchy of nighttime sounds. He woke to voices downstairs. Not alarmed voices. Controlled ones, which was sometimes worse than alarmed because it meant the people doing the controlling were doing a lot of it. He came to the top of the stairs and sat there and listened. Ronan was on the phone. Mara was at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug. Jace could see her from the angle of the stairs. Her face and profile, the particular expression of a woman who has heard things she has been bracing for and is now doing the math on what they mean. They moved the kids, Ronan said into the phone. All of them. When? A pause. How many hours ahead of the sweep? Another pause. The quality of his stillness shifted. Jace had been learning to read Ronan's silences the way he'd learned to read other things, by watching the body around them. The silence that happened now was the silence of a man receiving information that narrowed the field significantly. Who tipped them? Not a question, a statement with the period already in it. Mara closed her eyes. Find out? Ronan said. Tonight. He ended the call and stood in the kitchen doorway with the phone at his side and the particular quality of a person who is running a calculation they don't like the math of. How many? Mara asked. 11. They were at the Millhaven location, gone before Carver's team reached the perimeter. Gone where? That's the question. Jace sat at the top of the stairs with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up. He thought about 11 children. He thought about what it meant to be moved before a sweep. He thought about what had to happen for information about a sweep's timing to move from the people who planned it to the people being swept. Someone had told Hollis, and someone who had told Hollis was on the inside of something that should have been sealed. Mara said, very quietly, "Could it be one of ours?" The kitchen was silent for long enough that Jace's ribs hurt from not breathing. "I don't know," Ronan said, and the fact that he didn't say no, didn't say impossible, didn't say not a chance, that fact landed in the stairwell like something falling from a height. The days between that Friday and the operation had a specific texture, a texture Jace recognized from the periods in foster homes before things fell apart, a surface that appeared normal, that went through the motions of normal, but that had a tension underneath it like a drumhead pulled too tight, waiting for the impact that would either make music or break the thing entirely. Ronan ran 3 meetings at the chapter house. Jace was not brought to any of them. He was at the house with Mara and Ember, who could feel that something was different in the air the way children feel things, not in the specifics, but in the barometric pressure of adult emotion. Ember handled it by making more paper butterflies. She'd moved on from cups and paper bags and had gotten into the practice of folding old receipts, grocery lists, any slip of paper she found. There were 17 of them on the windowsill in the guest room. Cage came to the house on the 3rd day. He knocked, which was notable. Men from the club generally came in through the side or announced themselves to Ronan directly, the specific social grammar of an organization where formal entrances were for people who weren't yet inside the circle. Cage knocked on the front door and stood on the porch, and when Mara opened it, he said, "Ronan home?" And Mara said no, and there was a beat where he was clearly deciding whether to leave. He didn't leave. Is the kid here?" he asked. Mara looked at him with the particular expressiveness of a woman who had heard one thing about someone and was deciding how much of it to apply to the man currently on her porch. "He's in the backyard," she said. She stepped aside and let him through. Jace was doing the perimeter walk. He heard the back door and turned, and there was Cage, 22 years old with his hands in the pockets of his cut and his jaw set in the way of someone who has rehearsed something and is now not sure the rehearsal covered the actual situation. They looked at each other. "Hey," Cage said. "Hey," Jace said. Cage came down the steps. He stood at the edge of the dead grass and looked at the maple tree, and then at the fence, and then at Jace, and none of it was hostile exactly, but it had the quality of a person taking accurate measurements of a thing they'd been wrong about the dimensions of. "I said some things," Cage said. "I know," Jace said. "At the garage." "I know." A pause. "How much did you hear?" "Enough." Cage put his hands over his face briefly. Let them drop. "I wasn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I wasn't talking about you like a person. I was talking about a situation. That's a habit I have that's—" Another stop. "Not a great habit." Jace looked at him. He was 7. Cage was 22. There was a specific type of discomfort in watching a 22-year-old try to navigate an apology to a 7-year-old, and Jace felt it, and he decided the most useful thing was to not make the discomfort worse. "It's okay," he said. "It's not, really." "No," Jace agreed. "But it's okay." Cage looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression did the same thing Ronan's expression sometimes did. The shift of a foundation that has been resisting something and has just decided to stop. "You know what they called me," Cage said. "In the system?" Jace waited. "Case file 14 Delta 7, Cage said, "for 3 years. Every new placement, new worker, they'd reference the file." He paused. "Never my name, always the file number. Jace didn't say anything. I don't want... Cage stopped again. Started again, more carefully. I don't want to be the guy who treated you like a file number. The maple tree moved. The scratching sound, the one Jace had classified as companion. He looked at Cage, at the scar on his forearm that disappeared under his sleeve, at the way he stood like someone who had learned to be ready for things to go wrong and had not yet unlearned it, and thought that this man was not that different from himself, was in fact a specific possible version of himself at 15 years further down the road, with a leather cut and a road name and a found family that had come at a cost. What's your name? Jace asked. Your real one. Cage blinked. Marcus, he said, like he hadn't said it out loud in a while. Marcus, Jace said. I'm Jace. Marcus Cage Morrow held out his hand, not in the performed way of adults making a formal gesture with a child, just the regular, direct handshake of someone acknowledging another person is real. Jace shook it. Well, the operation was set for a Thursday. 2 nights before it, Deke came to the house at 11 o'clock with his jaw set and his road atlas under his arm and a look on his face that Jace had not seen on him before and did not immediately know how to read. Ronan met him at the door, and they went to the kitchen, and the door was closed all the way this time, which meant Jace heard nothing. He lay in the guest room and counted the butterflies on the windowsill by shape in the dark. 17. He knew each one by its silhouette. He breathed slowly. He was still breathing slowly when Ronan opened the guest room door at 11:45. You awake? Ronan said. Not a question. Yeah. Ronan came in and sat on the edge of the bed the way he'd sat in the hospital chair, like a man making himself available rather than imposing himself. He was quiet for a moment. We found out who tipped Hollis, he said. Jace waited. A man named Price. He's been doing clerical work for Carver's team for 7 months. Ronan's voice was level, controlled in the specific way of someone who is furious and has decided that the fury is not the useful thing to lead with right now. He's been feeding information to a contact in Hollis's network for most of that time. How many people knew about the operation? Jace asked. Enough. The wrong ones. Are the kids? We found the secondary location. The kids were moved there, not... They're okay. They're being secured. He said it with the specific emphasis of someone who needed that sentence to be completely true and was making it true through the weight he put on the words. All 11. Carver's team has them. Jace exhaled. Price was picked up 2 hours ago, Ronan said. Federal custody. He's talking. A pause. He gave them Hollis. The actual man, not the network. A name. A location. And? Ronan looked at the butterflies on the windowsill. He looked at them for a long moment, and whatever he was doing in that pause was something Jace didn't fully understand but recognized as a man arranging what he was about to say into the right order. Hollis has your file, Ronan said quietly. The county file. Someone in the county system sold it to him. We don't know who yet, but he has your name, your case history, your last 3 placements, the hospital admission. His jaw tightened. He knows who you are, Jace. He knows you're with us. The room was very still. The maple tree scratched the glass. Jace looked at the ceiling and thought about the word complication and thought about Cage saying loose thread and thought about every moment he'd spent learning the exits in this house, the gaps in this fence, the distances between the things that felt like safety and the things that were actually the edge of it. He'd been doing it automatically, the way his body had been doing it for 22 months, and he'd been trying to stop, and now he was glad he hadn't. What does he want? Jace asked. His voice was steady. It surprised him that it was steady. Ronan looked at him. He wants what every man like him wants when something exposes his network, Ronan said. He wants the thing that can talk to stop talking. He paused. He thinks you saw more than you did. So he's going to come here. Not here. We move you tomorrow morning. You and Mara and Ember go to a chapter house 3 hours north, closed location. Nobody who doesn't need to know knows. And you? Jace asked. Ronan didn't answer that. Ronan, Jace said. And you? I stay, Ronan said. With Deke and the road crew. We finish what we started Thursday night. He looked at Jace directly. The operation doesn't stop because Hollis knows about it. It stops when Hollis is in federal custody and there's nothing left to run. The maple tree breathed against the glass. Jace sat up in the bed. He was small in the room, small against the pillows, small in the oversized sweater with the 2 long sleeves. He looked at Ronan, at the man who had sat in a hospital chair at 4 in the morning and listened to a 7-year-old explain that a paper butterfly was the reason he hadn't let go. And he understood something that he did not have the full vocabulary for, something that lived at the intersection of what he was afraid of and what he had never, in 22 months, been able to let himself want. He was afraid that Ronan wouldn't come back from Thursday. He was afraid in the specific way of someone who had only recently allowed themselves to be afraid of losing someone, because you could only be afraid of losing what you'd let yourself have, and he had spent 22 months not letting himself have anything. He'd let himself have this. And now Hollis knew his name, and Ronan was staying, and Thursday was 2 days away, and there were 11 children who were safe because the men with leather cuts and road atlases had gotten to the secondary location in time. And somewhere in a federal holding facility, a man named Price was talking as fast as he could. And somewhere else, a man named Hollis was calculating the damage and looking at a county file with a name in it that he'd planned to use as leverage and finding out that leverage had a cost. "You're coming back," Jay said. It came out flat and hard, the way things come out when you're not asking them. Ronan looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming back." "You can't promise that," Jay said. The same words from the backyard. But this time there was something different in them. Not the cool empirical accounting of a child who had given up on promises, but the cracked, involuntary, entirely unwilled sound of a child who has started, against every lesson his life has ever taught him, to believe. Ronan reached out and put his hand on Jace's shoulder. Not squeezing, not performing reassurance, just placing it there, the weight of it, the specific deliberate weight of someone saying, "I am here right now and this is real." "Go to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow morning, early. I'll be there when you leave." He stood up. He moved to the door. "Ronan," Jace said. He stopped. "The man in the gray hoodie." "At the diner." Jace's voice was very quiet. "He's the one who has the file on me, or someone connected to Hollis does?" Ronan turned. His face in the low light was the face of a man choosing, again, between the easier answer and the true one. "The man in the gray hoodie," Ronan said, "is connected to Price." "Who is connected to Hollis?" A pause. "And Price, in federal custody tonight, told Carver something that Carver told us an hour ago." He stopped. Jace waited. "The man in the gray hoodie," Ronan said slowly, "was not in that parking lot by accident. Ember was not a random target." He looked at Jace with the careful, measured look of someone who has decided a 7-year-old has earned this. She was specifically identified. Someone gave Hollis's network information about Mara's routine. The diner. The evenings. The parking lot. His jaw set. Someone who knew us. The room was perfectly silent. The maple tree had gone still. Jace sat in the bed and looked at Ronan and felt the ground shift. Felt the thing he had been carefully building in the guest room with the 4 pillows and the 17 butterflies tilt on its axis. Felt every calculation he had been making about safety and permanence and what it meant that 52 men were riding a perimeter he couldn't see. Felt all of it tilt. Because if Ember had been a specific target, if someone who knew the Iron Reapers had fed her location to Hollis's network, then this was not something that had started the night Jace stood between her and a man in a gray hoodie. This had been in motion long before that night. And Jace, homeless, invisible, unknown, Jace with his county file and his paper butterfly and his cracked ribs, Jace had walked directly into the center of it, because a 5-year-old had looked at him like he was... Jace had walked directly into the center of it because a 5-year-old had looked at him like he was real. He sat with that for a long time after Ronan closed the door. The maple tree had gone still outside the glass, the way things go still before weather comes in. He could hear the house settling around him, the particular creak of a structure responding to temperature, the low hum of the refrigerator 2 floors down, the distant sound of Deke's voice from the kitchen, now just vowel shapes and cadence through the walls. No words. He sat with his knees pulled up on the bed and the 17 butterflies on the windowsill and the white one, the first one, the cup one, in his hand because he'd picked it up without noticing he was doing it. Someone who knew the Iron Reapers had given Ember's location to Hollis's network. He thought about that sentence in pieces, turned it over, looked at the underside of it. Someone who knew Mara's routine. The diner. The evenings. The parking lot. The specific fence where Ember always went. Someone who had access to the kind of granular domestic knowledge that didn't exist in a file. The kind that came from proximity, from trust, from being inside the circle close enough to watch the details accumulate. He thought about the chapter house, the men he'd watched there over the past 3 weeks, the quality of attention each one paid to different things. He thought about Cage's anger and Deke's atlases, and Wash's quiet, and the older man with the reading glasses who sat in the corridor outside the hospital room and never introduced himself. He thought about the way the club moved, not like an organization, more like weather, more like a system of pressure that had its own logic and its own rules and its own specific blind spots. He thought about which of those blind spots someone would need to be standing in, exactly, to watch and report without being seen. He didn't reach a conclusion. He was 7. He had a cut arm and cracked ribs and a county file that a man named Hollis was using as leverage. He was not the person who was going to solve this, but he was going to remember everything. He always remembered everything. It was one of the skills survival had given him that had no other applications in ordinary life. Total, involuntary recall of details that other people's comfort allowed them to forget. The specific brand of cigarettes Deke kept in his left chest pocket. The particular way the older man with the reading glasses touched the scar on his right hand when he was thinking. The fact that Cage had known about the operation's timeline before the Tuesday meeting, which meant he'd heard it somewhere before the Tuesday meeting, which meant... Jace stopped. He looked at the door. He looked at the butterflies. He pressed his palms flat against the mattress and breathed. He was probably wrong. He was a 7-year-old who had spent 22 months learning to survive by reading people. And he was probably pattern matching in the dark, connecting things that weren't connected, because his brain was scared, and scared brains found patterns even where there were none. Probably. He kept the thought in a locked room in the back of his mind where he kept all the things he needed to think about later in better light, with more information. He did not sleep. Tasim. They left at 5:45 in the morning, when the sky was still the deep, colorless dark of pre-dawn, and the neighborhood was making the particular sound of its own unconsciousness. Mara was calm the way water is calm right before it boils, completely still at the surface, everything happening underneath. She moved through the house with a packed bag over her shoulder and Ember on her hip, and a quality of total focus that Jace recognized as the focus of a person who has done hard things before and knows that the doing requires not feeling them yet. Ronan stood at the front door. He'd changed into riding gear, so the heavy jacket, the reinforced gloves tucked into his belt, the cut over everything. He looked exactly like what he was. A large man who had made a decision and had arrived on the far side of it, in the place where decisions become just the things you do next. He put Ember's hat on her head and fixed the strap under her chin and said something low into her ear that made her squeeze his neck very hard and then let go. He looked at Jace. "You remember what I told you," he said. "You're coming back," Jace said. "That," Ronan said, "and watch out for her." A small tilt of his head toward Ember, who was now examining Mara's jacket zipper with the focused attention of a child who had decided that the jacket zipper was the most important thing happening. "I will," Jace said. Ronan put his hand briefly on top of Jace's head, not messing up his hair, not performing affection, just the weight of a hand, present and deliberate. Then he opened the door, and the cold came in, and the sound of 2 Harleys idling at the curb, Deke and Cage, escort to the edge of town, came in with it, low and steady as a heartbeat. Jace walked out into the cold and did not look back at the house. He was afraid that if he looked back at it, he would understand too clearly what it meant to leave it. The chapter house north was in a town called Greer's Crossing, which was the kind of town that had once been something and was now mostly the memory of something. A main street with half its storefronts dark, a grain elevator visible from the highway, 2 stoplights that went to blinking yellow after 9 at night. The Iron Reapers had a property there that had been a machine shop, a long, low building set back from the road with a gravel lot and a chain-link fence and a metal rolling door that came down over the bay entrance. Inside, it smelled like oil and cold concrete and the particular stale warmth of a space that had been heated just enough and not a degree more. There were 4 men there already. Brothers from the Greer's Crossing chapter. Jace didn't know their road names yet, and they didn't offer them, which was its own kind of message. They were polite. They kept their distance. They were the specific kind of careful with Mara that men are with women they respect and are slightly afraid of, which in Jace's experience was the best kind of careful. Ember decided within 20 minutes that the machine shop was interesting and that the man named Dutch, who had a beard that reached his collarbone and hands the size of dinner plates, was her new favorite person because Dutch had a radio that could find exactly 2 stations, and one of them was playing something with brass instruments. Ember approved of brass instruments. Dutch looked at Ronan's 5-year-old daughter dancing to a radio in a Greer's Crossing machine shop like he had been assigned the most important job of his life and was going to do it correctly. Jace sat on a metal folding chair near the rolling door and watched the lot outside through the gap in the chain link and tried to feel safe. He almost managed it. The call came at 7 that night. Mara took it in the back room with the door closed, but the machine shop's walls were corrugated metal, and corrugated metal was not built for privacy. Jace heard her voice change pitch, heard the specific frequency of a person receiving information their body understood before their mind did. And he was off the folding chair before he'd made a decision to stand. He stood by the closed door. "How bad?" Mara said. Not a question. A pause. "Where is he?" Another not question. A longer pause. "I'm coming." The door opened. Mara stood in it with her phone in her hand and a face that was doing something very specific and very controlled. The face of a woman holding a container that was too full and was walking very carefully to avoid spilling it. "Deke is hurt," she said. To the room, not specifically to Jace, but she was looking at him. They hit the operation location before Carver's team was in position. It went wrong. She stopped, reorganized. "Ronan is okay. He's with Deke at a field location. Deke took a..." She stopped again. "He's stable. He's stable." "And the operation?" one of the Greer's Crossing men asked. "Partial," Mara said. "They got the primary target. Hollis is in federal custody." She pressed her lips together. "But they lost the secondary site. 2 men from Hollis's network are unaccounted for." The room was very quiet. "Unaccounted for where?" the man said. Mara looked at him with steady eyes. "That's what we're trying to find out." Jace looked at Dutch, who had stopped smiling. Dutch's hand had moved to his belt, which was not a conscious gesture. It was the gesture of a body that had been trained to respond to specific kinds of information in specific ways. The other 3 men were doing similar things, a collective, wordless recalibration, like a compass finding north. Ember was looking at Jace from across the room with very big eyes. He went to her. He sat on the floor next to her and she climbed immediately into his lap, which she had started doing in the past week without asking, as if the action was simply the next logical thing given the spatial arrangement. He put his bandaged arm around her. "It's okay," he said. "Is Daddy coming?" "Yeah," he said. She looked at him. "You always say that, and then you say it's okay." "I know." "It's the same thing you say when it's not actually okay," she said. He looked at her. She was 5. She had assessed him correctly. "Your dad is fine," he said. "Deke got hurt a little, but your dad is fine." She was quiet for a moment. Then she put her head against his chest, and he felt the specific weight of a small person trusting you with their body, which was not a thing he had ever experienced before the past 3 weeks, and which he still did not have adequate language for. "Okay," she said, very small. He held her. Outside, the cold was doing something to the metal roof, contracting it, making a series of low ticks that moved across the surface like footsteps. He watched the rolling door and the gap in the chain-link fence, and kept counting things the way he counted things, automatically, as a form of orientation. The distance to the door, the angles of the windows, the weight and position of every person in the room. He was still counting when the rolling door opened from outside and Ronan came in. Yeah, he had blood on his jacket. Not his, he said so immediately, before Mara could get to him, said, "It's not mine." and then let her reach him anyway. Let her put both hands on his face and look at him the way you look at something you were afraid to look at and are now looking at to confirm it's still real. He stood in the open, rolling door with the cold at his back and the oil smell of the machine shop around him, and he looked old in a way that had nothing to do with his actual age, the kind of old that comes from a specific night and not from years. Deke came in behind him, walking. Slowly, with a hand braced on the doorframe, but walking. His left side was wrong. Jace could see from across the room that something under the jacket on the left side was being held very carefully. His face was the color of old concrete, but he was walking and his eyes were clear, which Jace had learned was the marker that mattered. Dutch got to Deke before anyone said anything and became, without ceremony, the thing Deke was leaning on instead of the doorframe. They moved to a bench along the wall. Ronan came fully inside. The rolling door came down. He saw Jace. He saw Ember asleep against Jace's chest. She'd gone out fast, the way children go out when they've been afraid long enough that the body just takes over. Ronan looked at the two of them for a long moment. "She sleep okay?" he said. 10 minutes ago, Jace said. Ronan nodded. He moved to a folding chair and sat in it like the sitting was the first thing his body had been allowed to do in hours. He put his elbows on his knees and his hands over his face and stayed like that. Mara sat beside him. She put her hand on his back and didn't say anything. The machine shop was very quiet except for Deke's breathing, which was audible in the specific way of breathing that is doing more work than usual. Jace held Ember and watched Ronan and waited. God. It was Cage who told him. Not that night. The next morning, when Deke was sleeping in the back room on an air mattress with his ribs wrapped by a man from the Greer's Crossing chapter who had field medic training, and Ronan and Mara were in low-voiced conversation with Carver by phone, and the Greer's Crossing men were on their second rotation of watching the perimeter, Cage came and sat on the floor next to Jace's folding chair. Sat on the floor without ceremony, like he'd decided the floor was the right level for the conversation, and looked at his hands. "They knew we were coming," Cage said. "Not to Jace specifically, to the air in front of him." Jace waited. "Not a leak from Price. Price was already locked up. Someone else fed them the updated timeline." Cage turned his right hand over, palm up, and looked at it. "Someone who got the updated timeline from Ronan's call last night, between 11 and 2 in the morning." Jace sat very still. "Only 4 people had that update," Cage said. "Carver and his partner, Ronan, and—" He stopped. The machine shop ticked. Rooftop contractions, the slow work of cold on metal. "And who?" Jace said. Cage looked at him. His eyes had the quality of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just decided to put it down regardless of what breaking it means. "Garrett Price," Cage said, "the one in federal custody, but his brother wasn't." Jace stared at him. "Owen Price," Cage said. "He's been doing administrative work for the Greer's Crossing chapter for 2 years. Logistics, supply runs, chapter house maintenance." He paused on each word with the specific weight of a man who has been wrong about someone, and is now saying the words of being wrong out loud for the first time. He's the one who got Garrett into Carver's operation in the first place. The cold of the machine shop was different suddenly. More specific. More directional. "He's the one who gave Hollis the Millhaven location," Jace said. Not a question. "Yeah. And Ember, the diner. Mara's routine." Cage pressed his lips together. His jaw moved. "Yeah. He's connected to this chapter," Jace said slowly. "He's been here this whole time. He was here last night when Mara got the call." Cage looked at him without blinking. "Where is he now?" Jace said. "That," Cage said, "is what we are trying to determine." The air between them had weight and temperature. Jace looked at the rolling door, at the chain-link fence gap, at the angles of the windows. He had been counting automatically since they'd arrived. The distance to the door, 11 seconds at a run. He had been counting. "Cage," he said. "Yeah." "The 2 men from Hollis's network, the unaccounted-for ones." He kept his voice very even, very flat, the specific flatness that meant he was doing a lot of work to keep it that way. "Owen Price knew we moved here last night." Cage stood up in one motion. He was across the room and at Ronan's side before Jace finished the sentence, his hand on Ronan's arm, something low and fast in his ear. Ronan's head came up. His eyes went to the rolling door, to the windows, to Jace, then to Dutch, who was already moving toward the back room where Mara had taken Ember 20 minutes ago for breakfast. The machine shop became a different kind of quiet, the kind that isn't silence but is all motion and no noise, the specific orchestrated efficiency of men who have trained for situations where the next seconds are the ones that count. Jace stood up. "Stay here," Cage said, passing him. Jace stood where he was told. He looked at the rolling door. He breathed. He counted. The radio in the corner was still playing. The brass instrument station, something slow and bright that was absolutely wrong for the quality of air in the room. Nobody turned it off. It kept playing while Ronan made 3 fast phone calls, and the Greer's crossing men repositioned along the perimeter, and Dutch came back from the back room with Ember on his hip, and Mara behind him with her own jacket on, and her bag, a quality of readiness in both of them that meant the back room had a second exit, and Mara had already used it to assess the lot. "East fence is clear," Mara said. "West side?" She paused. "West side has a car I don't know." The room stilled. "Color to," Ronan said. "Gray. No plates." The radio played something bright and completely indifferent, and then the rolling door moved. Not from the outside. From the inside. The interior release latch, which meant someone who had been inside the machine shop long enough to know where the interior release latch was, had triggered it from somewhere in the bay, from some corner or recess of the long space that hadn't been cleared because they'd thought the cleared space was what mattered. The door went up 2 feet and stopped. In the gap, 2 feet of gray November morning, cold light, gravel, the sound of a car engine. A voice came through the gap, flat and unhurried. "Send the boy out." Everything stopped. Jace looked at the gap. He looked at Ronan. He looked at Cage, who had his hand somewhere under his cut and was very still in the specific stillness of a person who is deciding whether the next action makes the situation better or irreversible. "Nobody moves on this side," Ronan said. Very quiet. Very final. "Send the boy out," the voice said again, "and we drive away." Dutch had turned his body so that Ember's face was pressed into his shoulder, not seeing anything, the hand that wasn't holding her against the grip of something at his belt. Ember's hand was a small fist in Dutch's beard, and she was not making a sound because she had understood from the quality of the room that making a sound was not the right thing. Mara was looking at Ronan with a face that was not afraid. That was the thing about Mara. Not that she wasn't afraid, but that the fear was not where she put her face. She put her face at Ronan, direct and steady, and what moved between them in that look was a conversation that had no words and needed none. Jace looked at the gap. 2 feet of gray light, gravel, a car engine idling. The voice of a man who had done the math and arrived at the conclusion that Jace was the number that made everything else work. A 7-year-old county file. A loose thread. A complication. He thought about everything he had been in 22 months. Invisible. Manageable. Forgettable. The child in someone else's margin. He thought about Ember's hand on his wrist in the hospital. White means, "You're still here." He looked at Ronan. Ronan was already looking at him. His face said, "Don't." His face said it with everything it had, with the jaw and the eyes and the particular controlled fury of a man who has made a promise and intends to keep it regardless of what keeping it costs. Jace looked at the gap in the rolling door. He was 7 years old. He had a bandaged arm and cracked ribs and 17 paper butterflies in a guest room 3 hours south that he had not allowed himself to think of as his. He had a county file and a name that a man named Hollis had used as leverage in an operation that had now collapsed around everyone, including Hollis, who was in federal custody, which meant the men in the gray car were men without direction, without a network beneath them, without the infrastructure that made people like them dangerous in an organized way. They were dangerous in the disorganized way now. The kind of dangerous that was about not leaving witnesses. He understood this. He understood it the same way he'd understood the man in the gray hoodie's approach across the parking lot, not consciously, not in language, but in the animal layer of his brain that had been doing this longer than he'd been alive, and that was very rarely wrong. The voice came through the gap again, and this time it was not flat. This time it had an edge to it, the edge of a calculation running out of time. "Last chance," it said. "Send him out or we come in." Jace looked at Ronan. Ronan took one step toward him, and Jace did the thing that no one in the room expected, the thing that none of them had time to stop, the thing that came not from strategy or plan or any particular kind of courage, but from the same place that had kept him standing in a parking lot with a knife cut in his arm and his hand locked around the hem of a 5-year-old's jacket. He walked toward the gap. "Jace," Ronan's voice, low, hard, the voice of a man who does not say names like that unless they mean stop completely. Jace stopped. He was 6 feet from the gap. He could feel the cold air coming through it. He could see the gravel of the lot and the gray light and the edge of the gray car's front panel. He turned and looked at Ronan. "They want me," he said. "Not Ember, not Mara, not Deke. Me." He held Ronan's gaze. "I'm the loose thread." "You're not going through that door," Ronan said. "I know," Jace said. And something in his voice must have been different, because Ronan stopped moving toward him and was very still, reading the difference. "I need you to listen to me," Jace said. He was 7. His voice was 7. But what was in it was not 7. It was 22 months of learning to read situations faster than the situations developed, of calculating exits and distances, and the specific weight of adult decisions made about his life without his input. "I need you to listen to me for 30 seconds. A beat." Ronan listened. "They can't come through the door without announcing it," Jace said. "The door is the only entry on the front. You said the east fence is clear. Mara said so." He spoke in short, precise sentences, the way he had learned to speak in the moments that counted. "Mara and Ember go east fence. Dutch goes with them. Cage goes to the bay window on the south side where the chain link has the gap. I saw it when we came in. It goes to the alley. The alley connects to the main road." He paused. "Carver's people are already on the way. You made the calls. 3 minutes, maybe 4. "Jace, you stay here," Jace said to Ronan. "You and me. We make them think I'm considering it. We buy 4 minutes." He looked at the gap, at the gray light. "I'm good at being considered," he said. "I've been considered my whole life. I know how to make it look like I'm deciding." The machine shop was absolutely still. The radio played something with a trumpet. Ronan looked at him for a long moment, looked at him the way he'd looked at him in the hospital chair at 4 in the morning, in the backyard with the frozen grass, in the guest room with the butterflies, and the look was different each time, and this time it was the look of a man recognizing something he had not known he would have to recognize in a 7-year-old's face. The voice came through the gap. "Time's up." "Wait," Jace called out. He made his voice small. He was very good at making his voice small. He had spent a long time learning exactly how small to make it. "I'm coming. I need... Just wait. I'm scared." A pause outside. The radio played its trumpet, bright and indifferent and completely wrong, into the cold machine shop air. Ronan was moving. Quietly. Completely. The orchestrated efficiency that was not noise, only motion. Cage toward the south bay window. Dutch's heavy boots turning, Ember's small fist in his beard, Mara's jacket, and her bag and her steady eyes meeting Ronan's for half a second before she moved toward the east fence. Ronan came and stood next to Jace. He crouched down to Jace's level, which none of the men had done, which was not a patronizing gesture but a deliberate one. The gesture of a man making himself level with the person he was talking to. 4 minutes, he said. 4 minutes, Jace said. You don't go through that gap, no matter what. I know. And after this, Ronan said very quietly, you and I are going to have a conversation about what it means to be someone who matters, because you have apparently not fully understood that yet. His voice was steady, but the edges of it were not. The edges of it were the cracked, involuntary, entirely unwilled sound of a man who has started, against the calculations of a hard life, to love something. Jace looked at him. Okay, he said. Ronan stood. He positioned himself to Jace's left, between Jace and the rolling door, in the space that was not quite visible from the gap, present but not presenting a target, the specific body knowledge of someone trained to occupy space tactically. Outside, a door opened. Gravel shifted. Steps. Jace looked at the gap. He was small and scared, and he knew exactly how to use both of those things, because he had been small and scared for 22 months, and survival had made them into tools, and this was the moment where every tool he had was the right one, and none of them were enough, and they were going to have to be enough anyway, because there was a 5-year-old in Dutch's arms moving toward an east fence, and a man next to him who had put his hand on Jace's shoulder and meant the steps on the gravel stopped. Jace counted. 1, 2, 3. The gap in the rolling door held 2 feet of gray morning light, and nothing else. No silhouette, no movement, just the sound of a man who had stopped moving and was doing the same thing Jace was doing. Calculating. Reading the silence for information. "You coming or not?" the voice said. "I'm scared," Jace said again. He kept his voice at exactly the right pitch. Tolten. Not performing fear, just letting the real fear show at the edges while the center stayed controlled. He was good at this. He had learned it in caseworker offices and foster kitchens and every room where adults made decisions about his life while he stood in the corner trying to look small enough to be manageable. "Just give me a second." A pause. Behind him, Ronan was completely still. Jace could feel him the way you feel weather, not seeing it, just knowing it's there, knowing it has weight and direction and intention. He didn't look back. Looking back would break the picture. The picture was a scared 7-year-old standing 6 feet from a gap in a rolling door, deciding. 30 seconds gone. Maybe 40. 3 minutes left. Maybe 3.5. The gravel shifted again. 2 sets of steps now. The second man moving from the west side of the car, moving toward the door's exterior release. They were done waiting. "Ronan," Jace said. Very quiet. "I know," Ronan said. The exterior release engaged with a mechanical sound, and the rolling door began to move. What happened next happened in the space between 2 heartbeats, which is the space where trained bodies operate and untrained ones freeze. Ronan moved left, not toward the door, away from it, pulling Jace with him by the back of his sweater in one controlled motion that deposited Jace behind the workbench along the south wall. In the same moment the door came up and the cold came in and the 2 men came through it. They were not large. That was the first thing. Jace had been building them in his mind as large, the way threat always expands in anticipation, but they were just men. One in his 30s with a cut that didn't have club patches, just blank leather, and one younger, maybe 25, with the specific look of someone who had been told this would be simple. They had the gray car behind them, and the gray morning behind that, and they came in with the unhurried confidence of people who expected the space to be emptier than it was. It was not emptier. Ronan was between them and Jace before they'd taken 2 full steps inside. He didn't say anything. Ronan Vale did not, apparently, consider this a situation that required words. What followed was not a movie fight. It was not clean or choreographed or symmetrical. It was 2 men encountering a wall and the wall refusing. Ronan took the first man by the collar before he'd processed that the space wasn't empty, and the momentum of his own forward motion became the problem. Ronan used it, redirected it, put him into the workbench along the south wall with an impact that shook the tools hanging above it. The second man got his hand under his jacket and Ronan said, voice flat as concrete, "Don't." The second man looked at him, looked at the specific quality of Ronan's face in that moment. The face of a man who has made every calculation available and arrived at a place beyond calculation, the place where the math stops and something older takes over. He didn't draw. "On the floor," Ronan said. And then the sound came through the walls, through the corrugated metal roof, through the gravel lot, through the gray November air. The sound that Jace had been counting toward without knowing he was counting. Not 1 engine, not 5. The specific layered thunder of many, arriving from the east, from the direction of the main road, the direction of the alley where Cage had gone through the chain-link gap 14 minutes ago. The second man heard it. His face changed. "Floor," Ronan said again. He went to the floor. Agent Carver came through the east fence with 2 federal agents and Cage 2 steps behind them. and the machine shop filled with voices and radios and the specific controlled chaos of a situation arriving at its resolution from multiple directions simultaneously. The two men were in federal restraints within 4 minutes. Owen Price was picked up at a gas station 12 miles north 40 minutes later, his phone showing 3 sent messages in the previous hour, none of which had gotten a response because the people he'd been sending them to were already in custody or on the floor of a machine shop in Greer's Crossing. Jace sat on the workbench where Ronan had put him and watched all of it happen. He watched Carver, a lean man in his 40s with the particular tiredness of someone who had been building something for 8 months and had just watched it finish at a gas station 12 miles north, move through the space with the efficiency of a man closing a file. He watched Cage stand in the machine shop bay with his hands in his pockets and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was processing something he hadn't expected to feel. He watched Dutch come back through the east fence with Ember still on his hip and Mara behind him, and he watched Ember look around the machine shop with enormous eyes and then locate Jace on the workbench and point at him. "There," she said to Dutch, as if Dutch had been looking for Jace and had simply not known where to point. Dutch set her down. She crossed the machine shop in the specific unstoppable way she did everything and climbed up onto the workbench next to Jace without asking and sat there with her legs dangling and looked at all the federal agents and the two men on the floor and the radio still playing its brass instrument station in the corner. "It's very loud," she said. "Yeah," Jace said. "Are we okay?" He looked at the room, at Ronan, who was talking to Carver in low, direct sentences, his hand moving once to gesture toward the south wall, and then going still. At Cage, who caught Jace's eye across the room and held it for a moment, held it with something in it that was not the complication calculation, was not the loose thread accounting, was something different, something that had been changed by 14 minutes in a machine shop, and a kid who had stood at a gap in a rolling door and made his voice exactly small enough. At Deke, who had made it out of the back room and was leaning against the doorframe with his wrapped ribs and his concrete-colored face and his eyes doing the road captain's instinctive sweep of the room's exits and occupants, the sweep that said, "I'm still here and I'm still counting." "Yeah," Jace said to Ember, "we're okay." She leaned against his arm, the bandaged one, carefully. She always found the unbandaged side, every time, without being told. "I knew it," she said. Carver found Jace on the workbench at the end of it, when the radio had finally been turned off and the two men were in a federal vehicle and the machine shop had gone back to being a machine shop. He pulled a folding chair up to the bench and sat in it backwards, arms across the top rail, and looked at Jace with the specific assessment of a man who has been building a case for 8 months and has recently discovered that a 7-year-old was load-bearing in ways he hadn't accounted for. "You held them for 4 minutes, Carver said. 3.5, Jace said. A slight movement in Carver's face. "Close enough." He paused. "You know you didn't have to do that." "I know." "Ronan would have found another way." "Maybe," Jace said. "But this way worked." Carver looked at him, then at Ronan across the room, then back. "You know what Ronan Vale told me," Carver said, "when I asked him 2 weeks ago why the Iron Reapers were putting this much into an operation that wasn't their fight?" He paused. He said some things are everyone's fight. He said the ones who decide it's not their fight are the ones who made it someone else's problem in the first place. Jace looked at his hands, the bandaged one and the unbandaged one. He thought about the parking lot, the knife, the specific second when the choice hadn't felt like a choice, had felt like the only possible next thing, the way breathing feels like the only possible next thing. "Hollis is done," Carver said. "Price is done. The network doesn't have a head anymore. It'll take time to be sure, but—" He paused. "You're not a target anymore. That file Hollis had on you. We have it now. It's federal evidence. Nobody's using it." Jace absorbed this. "Okay," he said. Carver stood up. He folded the chair and leaned it against the workbench. He started to walk away, and then stopped. "Kid," he said without turning around. "For what it's worth, 8 months I've been building this. We got the network because a 7-year-old stood in a parking lot and held on." He paused. "That matters." He walked away. Jace sat on the workbench and looked at the empty machine shop bay. The rolling door was all the way up now. The gray morning had gone to something lighter, not quite pale winter sun, but the suggestion of it, a brightening at the edge of the clouds that could be sun, or could just be the clouds deciding to thin a little, which was its own kind of thing. He heard boots. He knew the weight of them now. Ronan sat on the workbench beside him. He was big enough that sitting on the workbench still put him above Jace's eye line, and he sat there with his elbows on his knees and his hands open, and the dried blood on his jacket that was not his, and the particular quality of a man who has come through something and is now sitting very quietly on the other side of it. They were both quiet for a while. "You said we'd have a conversation," Jace said. "I did." "About what it means to be someone who matters." "Yeah." Jace looked at the brightening at the edge of the clouds. "I'm listening," he said. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Jace could hear the distant sound of Harleys. Not urgent now, not perimeter holding, just the background frequency of men on bikes moving through a town in the morning, the sound that had become, over 3 weeks, something his body recognized as a particular kind of company. "Mara and I," Ronan started, then stopped. "We've been talking, since the hospital, since the first night." He turned his head and looked at Jace directly, with the direct, undecorated honesty that was the most consistent thing about him. "We want you to stay." The brightening at the edge of the clouds did not move. The distant Harleys continued their low rumble. Somewhere in the machine shop, Ember had found the radio again and was negotiating with Dutch about the brass instrument station. "Stay," Jace said. "With us. In the house. Permanently." Ronan paused. "We've talked to Marsh. We're starting the foster process. And after that—" He stopped. Let the "after that" sit there without completing it, because some things were too large to fit in a sentence, and he knew it, and Jace knew it, and the space between them held it instead. Jace looked at his hands. He thought about the 4 pillows, the one he used and the 3 against the wall. He thought about dinner tables and someone asking about his day, and the maple tree scratching the glass, and the 17 butterflies on the windowsill, and white means you're still here, and the specific, devastating, ordinary ritual of people who stay. He thought about every placement, every promise dressed in the language of permanence that had turned out to be dressed in it and nothing more. He thought about the cold between trust and capacity and the gap he'd lived in for 22 months. He thought about Ronan in the machine shop, standing between Jace and the door, not as a calculation, not as a managed situation, as a wall. "I'm not easy," Jace said. "I know. I check the exits, I count distances. I wake up and listen for what's wrong before I listen for what's right. I don't know how to have 4 pillows. I don't—" His voice did something he hadn't given it permission to do. He pressed his lips together, controlled it. "I don't know how to do any of this." "Neither do I," Ronan said. "Mostly I'm making it up." "That's not reassuring." "No," Ronan agreed. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment. "But I'm still here, and tomorrow I'll still be here. And the day after that I'll be here making it up worse than the day before, probably, because that's how it goes." He looked at Jace. "But I'll be there." The brightening at the cloud's edge made its decision. It was sun, not much of it. Thin, November, the kind of sun that doesn't warm anything, just clarifies it. It came through the open rolling door in a pale stripe across the machine shop floor and touched the far wall and stopped. Jace looked at it. His throat was doing the thing that made speaking difficult. He had gotten very good at working around it. He looked at the stripe of pale sun on the machine shop floor, and he thought about loose threads and complications, and what it cost to be those things, and what it cost to stop being them, and whether the cost of stopping was something he could actually pay without breaking something he'd been holding together. He paid it. Not all at once. Not cleanly. Not in the way that stories sometimes suggest payment works. A single moment of decision, a door opening, light coming through. It was slower than that and harder than that and more ordinary than that, which was somehow the most surprising part. He said yes. He said it quietly, still looking at the stripe of pale sun on the machine shop floor, his voice doing the difficult thing it had been doing, the cracked involuntary thing, and he let it do it this time instead of working around it. He said yes, and Ronan didn't make a production of it, didn't reach for him, didn't perform relief. He just sat on the workbench beside him and exhaled, a long, structured breath, the kind that carries a lot of weight on its way out, and that was the whole of it. Two people on a workbench in a cold machine shop in Greer's Crossing, one of them very large and one of them very small, and the pale November sun on the floor between them. Across the shop, Ember had won the radio negotiation. The brass instruments played on. But the foster process took 4 months. Linda Marsh, to her permanent credit, treated the paperwork with the urgency of someone who understood that bureaucratic time and human time were not the same thing, and that a child who had spent 22 months learning not to want things deserved to have the wanting acknowledged before it calcified back into not wanting. She moved things. She called people. She showed up at the Vales house in Calhoun Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon in March with a folder and a very controlled expression that became, briefly and just once, not controlled at all, when Jace opened the door and she saw him, saw his color, his weight, the specific quality of a child who had been eating regular meals and sleeping in the same bed and has begun, tentatively, to look like someone living instead of someone surviving. She pressed her lips together. "You look good, Jace," she said. "I have 4 pillows," he said. She laughed. It surprised both of them. The folder contained paperwork that meant he was staying. Not temporarily, not provisionally, not pending review. The language of permanence this time, with the actual structure underneath it to make permanence mean what it said. He signed his name where she showed him. His handwriting was getting better. Cora's Tuesday-Thursday kitchen sessions had continued through December and January and into the new year, and his reading had come a long way, and his handwriting, which had started as the urgent practical scrawl of a child who'd learned to write from whatever materials the shelter outreach provided, was becoming something he recognized as his own. Jace Mercer. He signed it twice and looked at it both times. Still his name. But it sat differently now. It sat like something that had a place to be. The adoption was finalized on a Thursday in October, 13 months after a November parking lot in a county courthouse that smelled like old wood, an industrial cleaner, and the specific institutional sameness of every official space Jace had ever stood in, waiting for adults to decide things. Except this time the waiting room had Ronan in it, who did not do waiting rooms easily and was doing this one anyway, sitting in a plastic chair with his cut over his dress shirt. Mara had asked about the dress shirt. Ronan had produced one. Nobody discussed it further. And his hands on his knees and his jaw doing the controlled thing. Mara sat beside him. Ember sat beside Mara, wearing a dress she had chosen herself on the grounds that orange was the best color. And this was an important day, and important days required orange. Cage was in the back row. He'd driven up the night before from Calhoun Ridge and hadn't made any particular announcement about why. Had just appeared at the house at 7 in the evening and eaten dinner with them and slept on the couch, and was now in the back row of the waiting room in a collared shirt that had clearly been purchased recently and fit him in the shoulders in the way new shirts always don't quite fit yet. Deke was there, fully healed or as close to it as Deke was going to get. He moved slightly differently now, a compensation his body had made and settled into, but he stood in the corridor outside the courtroom with his arms crossed and his road atlas inexplicably under one arm, and he looked at Jace when Jace came out into the corridor and said with total economy, "Good." That was all. It was enough. Dutch had sent a card. It had a butterfly on it that he had clearly found after deliberate searching, and inside it said, in handwriting that suggested Dutch was more comfortable with engines than pens, "You're real, kid." Jace kept it in the drawer with the white paper butterfly. The judge was a woman named Honorable Claire Sato, who had been doing family court for 19 years and had developed over those years the specific quality of a person who has seen the system fail more times than succeed and has decided that the response to that knowledge is not cynicism but precision, being exactly as careful as the situation requires, every time, without shortcuts. She looked at Jace over her reading glasses when he sat down across from her in her chambers, the less formal setting she used for finalization hearings involving children, and she said, "Do you understand what today means?" "It means it's permanent," Jace said. "That's right." "It means they chose it," he said. "Not because the county assigned them, because they chose." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Ronan, who was sitting to Jace's left, and at Mara, who was to his right, and at Ember, who was to Mara's right, and was examining the judge's nameplate with focused interest. "That's exactly right," Judge Sato said. She signed the order. She dated it. She slid it across the desk and said, to all of them equally, "Congratulations." Ronan put his hand on Jace's shoulder. Jace let him. Chum. They went to Della's diner afterward. Mara had suggested it, and nobody had objected, which said everything that needed saying. The diner was open. It was always open. Della's had the specific stubbornness of places that had stopped trying to be anything, and had therefore accidentally become exactly what they were, which was a place that was always there. The broken floodlight in the back had finally been replaced. The sign still had 2 missing letters. The parking lot was empty in the October afternoon, pale gold light across the cracked asphalt. They took the corner booth, the one with the window that faced the back lot. Jace sat on the inside next to the window. He could see the chain-link fence on the south end where Ember used to crouch with her paper butterflies. He could see the spot near the dumpster where he had slept, and the step where the cook had sometimes left a plate without looking at him. He looked at all of it. Mara ordered coffee for herself and Ronan and hot chocolate for Ember, and then looked at Jace and waited. "Coffee," Jace said. Ronan started to say something. "He's earned it," Mara said. Ronan closed his mouth. The coffee came in the same cheap paper ring cups as the hospital vending machine, which was either a coincidence or a particular form of continuity that the universe had arranged for its own reasons. Jace wrapped both hands around it. It was bad coffee. He drank it like it was the best thing he'd had in months, which was the same thing he'd done the first time. In the hospital, sitting across from a large man who had shown up at 4 a.m. and asked him why. Ronan was watching him. "What?" Jace said. "Nothing," Ronan said. But his jaw was doing the controlled thing, and his hands around his cup were the hands of a man holding something carefully, and the look on his face was the look of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not allow themselves to believe they were going to arrive. Ember was telling Mara, in sequential detail, everything she planned to do when she got home. The list was comprehensive. It involved the orange dress and the radio and a specific book, and informing Dutch by phone that she was now officially a sister, and Dutch was going to need to update his understanding of the situation accordingly. Cage sat at the end of the booth with his elbows on the table and his coffee untouched, and his eyes on the parking lot outside the window, not watchful in the threat assessment way. Just present. Looking at the same chain-link fence and the same cracked asphalt that Jace was looking at, and understanding, without either of them saying it, what the space had been, and what it was now, and what the distance between those two things had cost. "Cage," Jace said. He looked up. "Thank you," Jace said, "for the machine shop, for what you said on the floor that morning." Cage was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved. "Marcus," he said. "Marcus," Jace said. Something settled in Cage's face. Old weight, put down. The diner was warm. October light in the windows, the particular golden hour light that didn't last, that was already moving toward the blue of early evening, even as it came in. The coffee was bad, and the booth was vinyl, and somewhere outside, 3 blocks over, Jace could hear the low rumble of a Harley moving through the afternoon streets of Calvary, Missouri. Just one. Unhurried, the sound of a man going somewhere he wanted to go. He listened to it come and go. He thought about the parking lot, the knife, the cold gravel under his palms, the specific moment when he'd been on the ground with cracked ribs and a cut arm and the world going to black edges, and he'd reached out his hand and found the hem of a jacket and held on. He thought about what he'd been holding on to, in that moment, which had seemed simple then, just her, just the jacket, just the physical fact of not letting go, and which he understood now was more than that, had always been more than that, had been the first time in 22 months he had reached out instead of away. He had reached out and she had been there. And then, without plan or intent or any particular understanding of what it would cost or become, everything else had followed from that. Ronan set down his coffee. He looked at Jace. "How are you doing?" he said. Just that. No apparatus around it. Jace thought about it. He thought about it the way he thought about things that mattered. Carefully, without hurry, giving the question the weight it deserved. "I don't check the exits as much," he said finally. Ronan's face did the thing. the foundation thing. He looked at the table and pressed his lips together and looked back up, and his eyes were steady, and the thing he was holding back stayed held back, but only just. "That's good," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Yeah," Jay said. The October light moved across the table. Ember was still talking. Mara was listening with the full attending quality she brought to everything Ember said, which was one of the things Jace had watched most closely over the months. The specific, unremarkable miracle of a mother listening to a child like the child's words mattered. He was still learning what to do with witnessing it. He was less afraid of it than he'd been in November. He turned and looked at the back parking lot through the window. The broken floodlight, replaced now. The fence. The step where the cook had left plates. He thought about all the kids who were still out there, in the margins of parking lots and donation bins and the edges of spaces that had been mapped as safe. He thought about 11 children in a secondary location, moved and recovered. He thought about what it meant that 52 men had ridden through November dark because one of those children had not, this time, been alone. He thought about all the times before this time when there had been no 52. The Harley sound came back, not the same one, a different one, or maybe the same one circling, the sound of presence rather than passage. It moved through the October streets of Calvary and faded again and left the specific quiet that follows it, the quiet that has the shape of the sound still in it. Jace wrapped both hands around his bad coffee and looked at the lot where he had slept, and the fence where she had crouched, and the spot where he had stood with his arms spread and chosen something he didn't have a name for yet. He had a name for it now. He looked at the table, at Ronan's hand near his, at Mara's voice, warm and continuous, at Ember's orange dress and the way she said, and then, like the world was a sequence of things she couldn't wait to tell someone about. He thought, "I'm still here." He thought, "White means you're still here." He picked up his coffee. He drank it. Outside, the October light made its slow, unhurried work across the cracked asphalt of Della's parking lot, and the evening came in from the east the way evenings do. Not all at once, just gradually, the world deciding without announcement to become something quieter than it had been, something that could hold, for a moment, everything that had happened in it and let it rest. The engines were out there somewhere. They were always out there somewhere. And for the first time in a very long time, that sound meant he was not alone.